Okay. Okay, we're going to talk today about counseling the birth family about search. Did you get the handouts already? The ones over here? All right. Well, I'm Kim Butterfield, and I'm out of Syracuse, New York, with Counseling for Childbearing Loss, which is a small private practice that I have with my partner, Janice Scaturo. And we work with people who have had miscarriages, stillbirth, children born with handicapping conditions or critical illness, people with infertility. And during the last 5 years, we've also specialized very heavily in adoption loss. And we presented at 2 NASW conferences on this issue, and we're at AC last spring, and we've worked at regional conferences and with Origins and that sort of thing. So this is a real interest of ours. What I want to do today is to really talk about ideas for working with people who are searching, or who are interested in searching, but I also want to emphasize that I think a search group or support group is really essential. So if you are working with people, often your primary goal might be to just get them to a support group. It's a lot like working with an alcoholic, where you might work for a long, long time, and the best thing you do is get them into AA. Maybe you won't see them again after that, but at least you know you've got them to a place where they're going to start working on things. Also, I think that the premise here is that search is essential to really the ongoing process of living with adoption for the birth parent. And without search, I really think the birth parent won't move, that they'll tend to be stuck. Hi. We just started.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all right. We're hoping people will, trickle in. So we thought, because there was some confusion, I think, about the starting time with the initial brochure saying 9:30. So we're,
Yes,
okay.
that's what I had.
Did you really?
I
Did
had
you?
9:30. Yeah.
Did you have that in your head, really? 9:30?
Yeah, because we didn't get I just had the initial brochure. We
Oh.
said 9:30, and I just had confirmation.
Oh, it's making me think I should wait 10 minutes now. But well,
I was going to say it's a program.
it is. It says 9. We'll keep going. Okay. So the premise is that search is really essential to the birth parent moving towards some sort of healing, whatever kind of healing can take place. And also this presentation is going to look at search as a reconnection. And I'm going to emphasize the emotional issues, the relationship issues, this process, the emotional process, as a context for search. And it sets the stage for search, I think, to really, hi. Here we go. Okay, great. Come on in.
Around downstairs, so I think there's a lot of people at 9:30.
Do you really?
There's a lot of people moving still down in the main hall.
Uh-huh.
Like looking for rooms. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'll go slowly, and we'll let people come in, and then we'll have a lot of time to do some case discussion or whatever people want to bring up, okay? Okay. So what we're doing today is really setting the stage, talking about how to set the stage for search, how to work with it when people are going through it. And at the same time, I'm not really going to talk about the mechanics of search, like how to search, but if people have questions about that, we can discuss that. And at any point that I'm talking, if you want me to clarify anything, just let me know. What I wanted to do was to ask about, oh, you know what I forgot to mention when I told about who I am? I'm with Counseling for Childbearing Loss, and the brochures are over there. And that's my private practice with my partner, Janice Scaturo, out of Syracuse, New York, and we see people with a variety of childbearing losses. And we started working 5 years ago. I'll say a little more about that. We had worked together in an agency, and we started talking about, gee, what kind of private practice could we get into together? And we had, an interest in working with women and families, and we both, all of a sudden at the same time, came up with the idea that, nobody's really addressing childbearing loss. We see people, for instance, we had each seen couples who had experienced infertility, and then 10 years, even 20 years later, they come in to see us and their marriage is falling apart, and you ask them, about their history, and they tell you, gee, we went through infertility, 10 years ago. We said, well, how did you resolve it? And they said, well, we just stopped talking about it. And then you'd find people who had lost children years before and had never really had grieved it or talked about it in any way. We also would find that we'd have people in their 20s, say a young man in his 20s coming in with all sorts of vague sort of discomfort, depression, low-grade depression, and you'd talk with them and you'd find out that the mother had lost a child previous to this person being born. And there was a real possibility there that this was a replacement child, or that in some way this person was carrying some of that grief still that had not been dealt with. And we knew that from seeing our colleagues present cases that they really just hadn't addressed these issues. They'd skip over them, and I'll talk more about that later. So this was some of our motivation for getting into it. And it really, there are a few people in the country who do specialize in childbearing loss, but it's still kind of a new area, and I think it's being written about more now. It's really, at least there are some books out in the last 10 years, just like with adoption as a whole, this has been really talked about and addressed more. So that was one of the reasons we got into it. We also both got into it because of our personal issues with childbearing loss. I took the book Motherhood in Mourning by Peppers and Knapp. It's a wonderful book. I'll mention that in more detail. Took that home to read. My friend had already read it. She said, why don't you read this? This will give you an idea of what the grieving process is like for people who lose babies. And I took it home and I just sobbed through the whole book, and I said, is there something I haven't been dealing with here? And of course I'm a birth parent, so it really, for the first time, I was really in touch with my own loss. And so I've been struggling with that over the 5 years we've been doing this practice. And there are a lot of other losses in my own family, and in Janice's family as well. She had abortion and also other kinds of losses in her family, so we could really connect in a variety of ways to the clients that we chose to work with. And in the last 5 years also, I've co-founded a support group in Syracuse, so I've also been in touch with a lot of other birth mothers, adoptees, and networked throughout the country. Yeah.
What was the name of the book that you mentioned?
Okay, Motherhood in Mourning, and I've got I'm going to go over that in just a minute.
Okay.
So I'll tell you the date and all that. Okay. So my connection with other birth parents has been real important, and with people who've gone through this experience and really putting together our ideas about this. And so that we've read a lot of things, and paid attention to family systems therapy and trauma theory, and the new thinking in women's psychological development, the new writing in that area. But really a lot of what we do comes from our interaction with people who've gone through this, and we really try to learn from that continually, so we appreciate feedback. Okay, so what I want to know next is where are people coming from? Would people like to sort of just briefly say who you are and what your interest is, and whether you're a counselor or a birth parent or both or an adoptee or whatever? I want to sort of, I know I've talked with you and I can't see your name tag. So.
It's
Cindy.
Cindy.
Yeah.
I'm a clinical social worker in the Air Force, but also I'm a significant other in that my sister gave up her son for adoption 5 years ago.
Okay. Well, I won't put this on tape, I guess. Okay.
I'm Marty Ziova. I'm a birth mother. I started with my daughter 28 years ago.
28 years ago. And so you're in search now, okay? You in a group, by the way, Marty?
Yes,
Yeah.
Adoption Circle in New York.
Oh, good, okay. With Joe? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. You're Marty?
Marty.
Okay.
I'm Connie Dayton, and I relinquished my son 19 years ago, and I'm a birth mother.
Okay, hi, Connie. Okay, and are you sort of, you haven't searched yet? You don't know where?
I searched
You
and
have.
found and talked to him on the phone, and now his parents doesn't want me to contact him anymore.
Okay. I've got,
I've been cut off.
okay. Personally, I can relate to that with my son. He's 22, and I've talked to him once in the 5 years since I found him, so I'll talk to you some more. Okay.
I'm Jean, and I'm a birth mother. This is all real new to me. I just found out about this a month ago.
Oh, wow.
So,
Are you from Chicago?
yeah.
Yeah. I had spoken to someone else on the phone recently who was from Chicago and I think surrendered in Syracuse, but she was going out of the country this week and couldn't come to the conference, but she had just gotten into it too. Yeah. Have you started with the group here?
No, this is like all new to me.
Wow.
I've been out like 2 weeks before the conference.
Really? Oh, God.
But no, there was such a thing.
Oh, I know. It really blows you away when you start with this. It's great. You're very courageous.
I'm not sure what to expect.
Yeah. Oh,
have to start
good.
somewhere.
Sure, that's right. Yeah. Well, this is a good place to get information. Julie.
Yeah, so I'm Julie Gabal, and I'm an adoption investigator at the juvenile court in Kansas City, Missouri. And I act as an intermediary to locate birth parents. And sometimes I really don't know. I don't have the counseling skills sometimes to interact with them. And I've got to take this class to maybe
Yes.
learn some things.
And Missouri, is it? You said
Yeah.
they're doing this. You actually contact them.
Yes,
Amazing. They have that set up for any adoptee who comes and wants to.
The adoptee has to be 21, and
Uh-huh.
they have to have their adoptive parents' written consent, and then I can
Oh.
search for the birth parent.
Yes.
It's still somewhat
Right.
strict.
Right. But
There's
better than a
a-
lot of places. Right. Right. Wow. And you do the search yourself. Well, that's interesting. Okay. So you really have to do a lot of that sort of private investigation,
You
like
mean at
almost.
21, they
That's
still
right.
have to have their parents' consent?
Yeah.
Not wonderful, but it's better than the alternatives in a lot of other places.
Right. Okay. Well, we've got a variety here. That's really interesting. Okay. But we're all connected to adoption in some way. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm just going to go through this and let me start. The surrender to adoption means unfinished business for the birth family. If you read the little blurb in the synopsis there, you saw this. The birth parents' families of origin and procreation, I consider to be the birth family. And so it's business that usually becomes more complicated over time as a result of several things: the ongoing grief, the traumatic aspects of the surrender, and the secrecy and denial about the lost child in the family. So although search can't fully restore that child to the family, it does offer the family a way of coping with the chronic pain of living with family separation. And it does offer, I think, the possibility of restoring some sense of wholeness to the family. And by this I mean that search can help the family to acknowledge and integrate the loss of a member and work towards reconnecting with that lost member to whatever extent possible. In addition, the search process can facilitate the working through of family relationships that have been damaged by the adoption. Because it's a way for the birth family to take control of a situation that they've been out of control of, search can really be empowering. And it's an active way for people to come to terms with the adoption experience and to take care of family business. It's not just doing it inside yourself, like in a therapist's office, but really getting involved in relationships and working them through and trying to reconnect with the child and work that through. Okay, first today I'm going to say a word about birth parents entering counseling at different starting points, and then I'll talk about approaches that I think are useful in counseling the birth family about search, helping the birth mother to reconnect with the family, and helping the birth family to acknowledge past losses, both as a way of understanding how the family has coped with those losses in the past, and in terms of dealing with those losses that may have been buried and that will resurface with the working through of the loss of the child to adoption. So if, and I'll go into that more in a little bit. Lastly, I want to consider the ways in which birth parents dealing with their grief and moving differently in their family is going to affect current relationships with spouse, significant other, children that they're raising. And after that, what I was going to do, if we had a lot of people, would be a family scout, but what we can do is maybe do some mapping or talk about your individual families or cases that the two of you might have, okay? And then before we go, remind me, and you need to fill in your evaluation forms. They tell me I'm supposed to save time for you to do that, okay? So before I continue, I do want to mention some resources that I thought would be helpful. And if you're a professional, the first thing I would suggest is getting in touch with a support group. And as I mentioned, Janice and I do a lot of work with other kinds of losses. So not only did I co-found a birth parent support group so I could be in touch for my own need, with other birth parents and really understand that loss, but also we've been in touch with parents helping parents, which in our areas for started by parents who had children on the neonatal intensive care unit, children who are critically ill or handicapped, and we've been real involved with them and talked with them frequently. We've worked with cesarean prevention movement, and we've also worked with, let me see, what was the other group? Well, I can't think right now, but anyway, we have tried to connect with the support groups that are related to the issues that we're dealing with, and I think that that's a real good way to really get in there and know what you're dealing with and to get feedback about how to handle the issues with the birth parents you're working with or the adoption-related members you're working with. And then we also have a packet called the Adoption Packet that put together about 3 years ago. So some of it I would love to update if I had the time. I'd really get in more to looking at open adoption and the prevention of family separation in the first place. But this was done with the Council on Adolescent Pregnancy in our area, and I did it with a committee of people. There were people who were adoptees, adoptive parents. We had people who worked with pregnant adolescents, people who worked with adolescents, and teachers. And so it was a real joint effort, and it was a real educational experience for the people who worked on this packet, because a lot of them had not had much exposure to adoption issues. And we put in little pieces on birth parents, adoptees, adoptive parents. We had each of those parts of the triad write their own piece, and then we talked about how to work with members of the triad. And some of the material I'll talk about today will be in here. But the best part is the bibliography. It's very extensive and is annotated. And so I would recommend it just for that, because it really gives you a lot of resources. And it's 3 years old, so there are a few other resources I'll mention that have come out since then. But it does have all the basic adoption resources and other related resources that would be helpful in working with adoption triad members. This is also an educational activities we have here. So if you do workshops at all, this is great. The people who were the educators that worked with me putting this together wrote up these exercises, and they're really neat. So some of them are like having, you can use them in a high school class, you can use them with adults. Some of them have to do with like taking a ball of yarn and connecting everybody with yarn and making it clear how interconnected the adoptive and birth families are, for instance. So some really fun stuff. So if anybody's interested in this, you can talk to me about it. It does cost something, but because the money goes to the Council on Adolescent Pregnancy, but let me know about it after if you're interested. Okay, Clinical Practice in Adoption is probably in the bookstore. I haven't been in there yet. It's by Robin Winkler, Dirk Brown, D-I-R-C-K, Dirk Brown, Margaret Van Keppel, K-E-P-P-E-L, and Amy Blanchard. And it's Clinical Practice in Adoption, 1988, New York, Pergamon Press, P-E-R-G-A-M-O-N, Pergamon. Let's see. Dirk is an adoptee psychotherapist who works out of New York State, and Van Keppel was one of the people who did the study on birth parents out of Australia. And this book is a real good outline to looking at all the adoption issues for adoptive families and birth families. The only reservations I have is that they don't address family issues enough to my liking, but they still do the basic issues. And I think there are ideas about search I probably would disagree with some. They sort of imply that the birth mother needs to resolve her grief before she searches, and I think that it's not that simple. Okay. Then the other book that I would recommend that you may already have if you're into family therapy at all is The Changing Family Life Cycle, a framework for family therapy. Changing Family Life Cycle, The Changing Family Life Cycle, a framework for family therapy, edited by Betty Carter and Monica McGoldrick. Betty Carter and Monica McGoldrick is McGoldrick. And that's put out by Allen, A-L-L-Y-N, and Bacon, Boston, 1989. And they have a couple of really good chapters on loss in the family, and the whole book is just, how to work with families, and so it's very good. And for working with children who are part of birth families and with adoptees, Helping Children Cope with Separation and Loss by Claudia Jewett. And if you're a birth parent, you have children that you're raising, this is really would be helpful to you just in understanding what your children might go through, and also in understanding what the child you surrendered has been through, and it's, in terms of their grieving throughout the life cycle. In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan. Has anybody heard of that? In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan. And that is real easy to get, usually at the library. It's good reading for anyone who's interested in women's development. It's sort of the forerunner of some of this writing on women's development that's been coming out in the last, 7 or 8 years. And it's very, what she says basically is that we haven't really known about how women develop, because all the studies we've done about how people develop have been done on men or little boys. So we're finally, in the last several years, understanding that women develop differently, and I'll touch on that a little bit. But if you're interested, the Stone Center out of Wellesley, Mass., I can pass this around, this is my only copy, but they put out a lot of new writing. They've got some really dynamic women doing some writing, and I think their material is real relevant if you're working with birth parents or adoptive parents, mothers, any women that you're working with, adoptees, can really apply some of their thinking to what the issues would be. Okay, different starting points. Clinicians working in adoption and post-adoption services are more apt to see birth parents who have a degree of awareness about the effect of the surrender on their lives. Those birth parents who approach adoption agencies may be moving directly into search and are more apt to work through some of the loss issues. For instance, they will probably have gotten through the worst of the numbing that happens initially, the denial stage. And they'll probably have broken through the secrecy to some extent in their family anyway. These people may have made an agreement to themselves right from the moment of surrender that they were going to search once the child turned 18 or whatever. And so once they put this plan into action, these people really are starting to move in healing themselves, I think. And they really may use counseling in only a peripheral way. So if you're I don't know if you would have that kind of thing happen, but probably not so much. As someone who works in an adoption agency is more apt to see that, I think. But I think even those people, if they can really truly empathize with birth parents and really understand the issues, the birth parents will go back to them and ask for help and say, gee, I need to talk with my husband about this. Can you help me figure out how to do that? Or I need to tell my children. And I think that those kinds of issues will then engage the birth parent and the adoption worker, and they can begin to the adoption worker can begin to really facilitate that process. Therapists working in mental health centers and family service agencies, other general counseling settings, will not usually have clients coming in with the loss of the child as a presenting problem. I mean, we don't go in and say, oh, I lost my baby to adoption, 10 years ago, now I want to deal with it. That usually isn't the case. And typically, I think what happens is people who suffer surrender to adoption, that loss, enter therapy with symptoms of anxiety, depression, interpersonal family problems, and they don't identify the loss of the child as the presenting problem. So even during the course of therapy, these men and women might not reveal that they've surrendered a child. And I had several cases like this when I worked in mental health and family service agencies. One case involved marital discord where the wife was really out of control with her anger. And several weeks into counseling, the husband just happened to mention that his wife had surrendered a child 15 years ago, and he wondered if maybe this might be part of why she was so enraged at present, and that it might have been stirred up because she just had to go back to work and leave her youngest child at home with a sitter. And actually, that did turn out to be very relevant. When she started to think about that, it really struck her that, yes, I'm really angry that I can't be with my child and that I couldn't be with my baby. And she began to be able to work it through a little bit. Now, even if therapists are aware that there was a child surrendered, often they don't recognize the impact of the adoption loss on the parents or its place as a central therapeutic issue for people. So if you're going into therapy, you might find that your therapist will kind of discount it or not really see it as central to say, well, that's an issue, but what are some of your other issues? A colleague once presented a case where a woman had been hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital briefly after she surrendered a child 10 years before. And he saw the the hospitalization as an indication that she had very poor ego strength, and not an indication that she was in fact responding in a very understandable way to having lost her baby, that she got profoundly depressed. Now, much as we've done in our work with alcoholism or with war veterans who may be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, we really have to ask the right questions when we work with birth parents. And we have to go in and really delve a bit to find out if this is a central issue, if this is the central issue for these people. And in most cases, the therapist needs to spend a lot of time exploring with the birth parent the surrender experience and its impact on her life. And this may mean working on related issues until the birth parent eventually breaks through the numbing and sees a connection between the loss of her child and the problems that brought her into therapy. And it's obvious then that the way that birth parents or other members of the birth family enter therapy will influence the nature of counseling. How we weave together the search and the family work will vary. And in the case of the birth parent who's asking for search information, our focus is to respond to her direct request, providing information about search, and also try to be available to provide support in handling all the family business that gets stirred up along the way. And she's already in the process of reconnecting with her child and with her family, and our role is to facilitate that process. And I think I really want to emphasize that when birth parents do start to search, they really need validation, because, you know, for us to search, it's going against all those messages about how you're supposed to forget, and, you know, and there's enough messages out there like, what do you mean you're searching? How could you do such a thing? Why would you want to disrupt the family? And so the clinicians have to be very careful not to start out by sitting the person down and looking them in the eye and saying, well, have you considered the negative consequences of this? You know, this could really be a very dangerous thing to do. And I can't tell you the number of, you know, clinicians that do this, because they're so anxious themselves. I think it's such a new thing and they don't know what else to do. So that naturally, hopefully, you know, as you work along, you can discuss all the different possible outcomes. But the birth parent is usually well aware that some of the outcomes may be very negative. For the birth mother who hasn't even acknowledged her loss, we need to work at a slower pace. And although we need to respect the denial, if that birth mother needs to still be in denial and can't really fully tolerate the pain, you need to respect that. But at the same time, you have to sort of balance it with needing, you know, you have to provide them with a framework for understanding what they're going through, which will give them the option of moving out of that denial and starting to grapple with the grief. So at the same time that you don't push too hard, you kind of pull a little bit, you know, and then you sort of let, you know, support them in sitting back a bit. But it's important to really work with that process over time until they can move out of it. And even to make suggestions, you know, someday you might want to search. That's real important to say those things and not to be timid about it, because that's, I think, when I think about that, it reminds me of the kind of counseling that birth parents get when they're surrendering. I've talked to adoption workers who actually didn't want to see the women surrender, but they'd say, well, I can't be non-objective. I have to just sit here and say nothing, you know, even if I think it's not a good idea. And I said, well, why? You know, why don't you just say, gee, you know, if you were talking to any other parent and they were doing something you thought was damaging to themselves and to their child, you would certainly say something. You wouldn't allow them to separate from their child without fully exploring that and really saying to them, if you really felt that it was a problem, gee, this doesn't sound like a good idea to me, you know. So I think that that's something I'd like to see clinicians feel a little bit more freed up to do. So I am talking a lot about birth mothers, I realize, and that tends to happen because we don't see a lot of birth fathers in therapy. We see them incidentally. We do see them in a general counseling setting. You'll see people come in. I've had a man in his 40s, for instance, who it turned out he was having a problem with his son by a current marriage who was acting out, an adolescent. He couldn't get quite connected. They couldn't quite connect. Turned out this man had had a little boy years before, and he was very, very close to his little boy. And when the little boy was 2, he and his wife separated, and she ended up remarrying and sort of forced the issue of having the little boy adopted by her second husband. And so this man never saw him again. So that was clearly an issue for him that was getting stirred up by this.
Do you mind if I sit over there?
Go ahead.
I've got multiple sclerosis in my bones.
That's fine with me. You want me to pull it out, in fact, with that?
That's all right. I'll just
Yeah?
sit over there.
Okay, yeah, I know. Those look like much better chairs. Okay, so anyway, we do see fathers, but a lot of our thinking is around mothers because that's really what we know about so far. We can talk, if anybody has a special interest in birth fathers, I'd be glad to talk about it more because I do have some ideas about it. And a lot of these ideas apply to birth fathers, but this next section on reconnecting is specific to women, okay? The birth mother, this is about reconnecting, okay? The birth mother has typically been seen by helping professionals as an isolated figure. And this is reflective of her emotional state. But when we, as professionals, treat birth mothers as if they're separate from their families, we really reinforce the isolation. And we need to place birth mothers within the context of their families and help them reconnect with their families because, as I've said, there's usually a disconnection that's happened. And surrender is an experience of disconnection for women and for their families, and it needs to be addressed and corrected to whatever extent possible. The birth mother's pregnancy generally creates a crisis that is resolved by the surrender of the baby from the family. And typically the surrender is accompanied by ostracism of the birth mother, or at the very least the weakening of significant relationships in her life, particularly the relationships with the women in her family, her mother, her sisters, her aunts, her grandmothers. These women sometimes can't empathize with the birth mother, and the bond that they've had really weakens. The pregnancy and the surrender, the very existence of her child, become taboo subjects in the birth family. And so the birth mother really becomes a stranger in her own family many times, at least to some degree. She feels alienated, removed, unwanted, unworthy, unacknowledged, not responded to. This disconnection is an especially serious matter for women because researchers are just finding that women's development and sense of identity is based on relationships with significant others. And as Jean Baker Miller, who's the author of Toward a New Psychology of Women, says, women's sense of self and of worth is grounded in the ability to make and maintain relationships. So when these core family relationships are damaged, often in the case of birth mothers at a very young age, there's the potential for a lot of harm to the birth parent's sense of self and self-worth. And for this reason, one of the keys to helping birth parents is to facilitate their reconnecting with their families. And this will then provide the birth mother with a stable base from which to reach out and reconnect with her child. Okay. This is really consistent with a family systems approach for working with highly stressed families that have shut down. And the effort is toward establishing at least one relationship within that family system that's open. So you look to get two people talking to one another. And what often happens with therapists is that if we have one person come in the family and that person is really uncomfortable, our tendency is to really connect with that person and just sort of calm them down and take care of them and sort of help. And what happens is that does calm things down, and it even calms things down in the family. But it doesn't really help that person or the family to move in the direction of working things out. And what you really need to think about is that person in your office needs to be directed to go back into that family and make a connection and start communicating more openly about the birth parent experience, about the adoption loss. And that usually means helping the birth parent to connect, really exploring the family first of all, and helping them to connect with someone who's going to be the easiest person to connect with first of all. Don't try with the most difficult. So, past losses, okay, right here. And do you have the genogram handout that has a little, let's see, I'll lose my tape recorder here. This one. You can just sort of look at that if you want while I'm talking. Okay, an important context for counseling the birth family about search is the family history. And this is helpful for the clinician to just get a feel for the fabric, the texture, the style of that family. And more specifically, it can help to define who's who in the family and to find sources of support. Now, by this I mean, like in doing in one family, doing some history and some research with a birth mother, we discovered that the aunt, now in her 70s, had an abortion when she was in her 20s. So what happened is this was helpful for the birth mother to know that her aunt, had had an abortion when she was in her 20s, so that she, the birth mother, wasn't the first one, to have a child out of wedlock. And it really was very reassuring. And it also meant that there was a potential that this birth mother could connect with that aunt. Because it's possible that aunt would be receptive, to talking to her and could understand and empathize with her if we can move that birth mother in the direction of making that connection. But even if the birth mother can't talk to the aunt for whatever reason, at least knowing that information is very helpful. Okay. Looking at the history will also be helpful to understanding the impact of the pregnancy and the loss on the family over time and the impact that search might now have. In our practice, we look specifically at the history of illness, family separation, loss, and crises to help explain the family's current style of coping and adaptation around loss. Hi. Come on in. There's some handouts on the table if you want to grab a couple. Okay. Hi. Okay. So, an example of how families cope with loss would be, again, to look at this aunt who had an abortion in the 1940s, okay? And we want to look at how the family handled that previous loss. And of course, we find that in the 1940s, which would have been very typical, the family made it into a terrible secret. It really became something that couldn't be talked about. Hi. And there was a lot of shame and guilt accompanying it. The aunt who had the abortion felt terrible shame, as did her mother who knew about it and helped her get the abortion. In addition, the mother felt terrible guilt a few years later when the aunt married and then could not conceive, was not able to have any children after having had the abortion. So all these very strong, intense feelings were carried in the family for many, many years, and were present when this birth mother in the 1960s ended up pregnant and surrendered her baby. Okay, and of course affected what kind of adaptation and coping postures this family had available in its repertoire to offer to this birth mother when she became pregnant. The family really just as a whole could not deal with this because they had already been through something like this and they just wanted to shut it out. So we're concerned about looking for negative postures of coping that happen over time. I mean, I can even think about this sort of a very physical way, like this, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to deal with it. And we're also looking for positive coping postures that might be of help if we could kind of key into them and use them, if the family has those resources available, use them to help the birth parent in her current situation of where she's going to begin opening the issue up. Now, going back 3 generations can really give the birth parent some perspective. It can give you as the clinician a lot of perspective, too, on the family, because you really find a lot more. You find that there are other losses. It gives you some sense of this birth mother not being the only one. And it also gives you a sense of what that family has for strengths and resources. It also allows the birth parent to see the power of the intergenerational themes and patterns in the family, and to kind of take the onus off herself, because birth parents feel so terribly responsible for everything. And if this birth parent can look back and say, gee, there have been other people in my family who've had some experiences similar to mine, and look, the family has coped in a similar way, and no wonder. I mean, there's all this energy around losing children in the family, and it wasn't just my situation, and it in fact explains to me why the family couldn't be there for me. It also explains to me that maybe the fact that I surrendered wasn't just because I did it. It was because the family was constructed in such a way that this pretty much had to happen. Okay? Doesn't mean it should happen. Okay. We've tended to find losses when we've looked at families, birth parents' families, where the mourning is unresolved. Now, the surrender to adoption itself is generally this kind of loss, but there are usually previous unresolved losses in birth families. and we haven't done a whole-scale research on this, but we really do find this. We know that these long-buried losses interfere with other relationships, and we think, in fact, that in some cases, they may have contributed to the family's inability to keep the child within the family in the first place. Because families go to great lengths to avoid pain and to maintain the status quo. So past losses often lead to more losses. Let me give you some examples of these buried losses that may have contributed to the surrender in the first place and that are probably going to surface when the birth parent starts to deal with the loss of her child. Now, some of these are fairly straightforward, like in this family. We have the pregnant teenager, and her father died a year ago. She gets pregnant, and her mother is still grieving, is barely able to figure out how to cope with her life on her own, and just cannot be there for her daughter. Now, at the same time, you can see, you have to be careful not to make too many cause and effect, kind of assumptions, but there really is some possibility that this birth mother was really kind of on her own and really kind of lost, and that may have been in some way reason, maybe not even so much for getting pregnant in the first place, because I always say, the majority of young people are sexually active, and it may be that people get pregnant because they're more fertile, than others. It doesn't necessarily mean they get pregnant because they want to have a baby or because there's some deep-rooted psychological meaning to it. But the fact that they surrender is the issue for me. I think the fact that they surrender is what makes them different from other families, because most families, back in the 60s, for instance, if there was an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, generally the couple got married. 90% of the couples, no, that's not right, but 90% in the 60s would have surrendered out of 10% that kept and were unmarried, but still a large majority of people got married. Okay. So, and then we move on to this family here. In this family, the birth parent herself is, where are we? Okay, is an adoptee, all right? So we have her parents who have not dealt with their infertility issues, which means that they were not really able to be there for this adoptee when she was growing up and helping her to deal with the loss that children experience as adoptees growing up. And then, this is her birth family, by the way, so I have her twice. This is her as the child that was born and surrendered from this couple, okay, and then she went into this family. She grows up, and she has a relationship with this man, and then they have a pregnancy, okay? So this adoptive couple hadn't dealt with their own infertility. They were unable to help their daughter deal with adoption loss in her life, and then could not help her deal with the pregnancy, and as a result, she really didn't have any options. Her only option really was to surrender. In other situations, the losses really take some tracking. In this family, the mother of the pregnant woman revealed, this is the mother, after this girl had surrendered her baby, the mother revealed that she, 10 years before, had a stillborn baby. And see, this didn't even come out in the counseling before the surrender. And it really, if someone had done a genogram with them, they might have discovered this. And so it made it especially difficult for the mother to deal with her daughter having a baby, to even think about what to do. So instead of preventing another loss, it created another loss. Okay. In this family here, let's see, we have the birth mother is down here, okay? Can you see this? And this is the grandfather of the birth mother, the father's father. Well, he committed suicide back here, all right? So this father, when his daughter became pregnant at the same age that he was when his father killed himself, he was so overwhelmed by feelings of shame that he had not resolved from his father's suicide. They then got transmitted to the daughter's pregnancy. And he was just not able to get through that in any way. He just had to act as if it wasn't happening, which meant that she ended up surrendering. I have one other example, and this was I didn't have room for it, or did I? Yes, I did. Here it is. Okay, this is another birth mother here. And in this family, her mother, as a 3-year-old, lost her 6-year-old sister in an accident. Okay, so here's the grandparents, the mother of the birth mother and the birth mother, her sister. This is the father in the family. Okay, the mother lost her 6-year-old sister in an accident when she was 3, and this woman, the grandmother, felt so guilty and terrible and never was able to resolve the death of her oldest child from an accident. And the grief was ongoing and very intense until she died for years and years. So this mother was really unable to be there at all for her daughter around the daughter's pregnancy. The mother felt so overwhelmed by her own mother's grief, she just could not deal with her daughter, who was having a baby, and could not empathize with the pregnancy, couldn't empathize with the loss afterwards. It ended up being a cutoff. We just cut off any thinking about it, any dealing with the emotions about it, and we cut the child off from the family. And eventually also the birth mother usually gets cut off from the family to some extent, because the birth mother also reminds you of the pain. Okay. I have another example of a birth mother's father grew up in an orphanage. So dealing directly with his daughter's pregnancy would have meant that he'd have to deal with the loss of his own parents. And he couldn't tolerate that, so he sent his daughter off to a maternity home to just try and forget it. And then, of course, it created another loss for him, because he lost his grandchild. Another family, the birth mother's mother. This is a pretty complicated one. They didn't have room for it on the board, but let's see. The birth mother's mother and her twin sister were born into a family after the 2 oldest boys in the family had died in a drowning accident. You got that? Okay. So the birth mother remembered her grandmother commenting that she didn't know what she would have done to cope with her older sons. So these twin daughters then, as replacement children, had very strong postures of trying to be good and having to deny loss and just be happy and sort of meet their mother's needs to distract her. And of course, when one of the twins had a daughter who became pregnant, she wasn't able to be there for her. She really couldn't tolerate dealing with the pregnancy or the subsequent loss over time. Now, current relationships. Okay, it's the last piece here. The birth parent who opens up the issue by pursuing therapy, search, or both will undoubtedly stir things up in the family. In addition to uncovering past losses, and the family's going to resist that, the birth parent's movement will create anxiety in the family of procreation, the family with the spouse and the current children, the children that the birth parent is raising. Consider that birth parents may even marry people who tacitly agree to help them keep the lid on the birth parent issue. The spouse may even have played a rescuer role with the birth parent. So the spouse may see himself as saving her from her desolation, or even marrying her even though she's immoral and kind of saving her from her immoral status. When the birth parent starts to deal with the loss of her child, this may be disconcerting to the spouse because it's really not part of that original agreement to keep the lid on things, And it may threaten him that she's no longer relying on just him for support. It's also probable that the secrecy and the denial around the loss to adoption has permeated other areas of the relationship, resulting in a general dampening of intimacy. So the birth parent's move toward dealing with her feelings may place demands for intimacy on the relationship that were not there before. And let me offer some examples in this area. Soon after surrendering her first child, one woman married a man who was very controlling, and this really fit with where she was at. She was feeling very out of control and just terrible about herself, and she needed someone to kind of hold her together. So she married this man, but over the years she went into therapy and she got herself together and she really got more solid, and she decided to search. And he, encouraged her while she was in therapy, and he was pretty supportive, her husband was, and even encouraged her to search. But as soon as the search started for real, he got a little nervous and he started to become more controlling again. And his latest demand was that she hand over all the search information to him so that he could review it first before she saw it. Okay. Now, in one case, she's not letting him do that. But this is the kind of stuff that, can come up. In one case, the birth mother told her husband that she was going to search for her 2 surrendered children. She had one and then another a couple years later. And although he had never expressed any negative feelings about her having had 2 babies and surrendered them, once she said she was going to search and they were going to become a reality, he got very anxious. And he really didn't want her to tell their children or his parents. He was not too excited about that. In this other case, the birth father did not find out for sure about his surrendered child until the child was 3 years old, and he and the birth mother happened to meet accidentally, and she told him about the child. She had sort of told him, oh, I'm not really pregnant in the first place, so he was never very sure about what had happened. Within a year after he found out about his son, the birth father married a woman who had a 2-year-old son. She had been married previously, and her husband had been physically violent towards her, and so this man then came in, this birth father, and was able to meet his needs by rescuing this woman, which he had not been able to do with the birth mother in this case, and in taking over the fathering of this 2-year-old son, which was a wonderful replacement for him with his the 3-year-old that he had lost. So this woman, he told this woman that he married about the child that he had lost to adoption, and she was very sympathetic. But 15 years later, when that birth mother recontacted the birth father about searching, this wife became very threatened and discouraged the birth father from becoming involved. So that's very typical from what I understand with birth fathers. They spoke last year at the AC conference and said that often the marriages are really disrupted in the birth father situation by search or by the birth mother contacting or the adoptee contacting, because whereas at least women tend to have that ability to deal with emotional issues and can face the idea of working them through, the men have tended to marry someone who will help them definitely keep the lid on, and the men are just really much more ambivalent or unable to work through the emotional issues, so it just stirs all sorts of things up in their relationship with the spouse. So we bring these spouses in. We want to involve them as directly as possible, so we try to get them into therapy, and we work with the couple in renegotiating the marital relationship. And in addition, we ask to see the children usually, or we talk with the birth parents about the children. We've observed aspects of grief in these children of the birth parents, the children that they're raising, much as we'd see when there's a sibling death. And in addition to the sadness that they feel themselves about having lost a sibling, and children by age 9 are definitely aware of what they've lost. They can really be aware of that and process it. In addition to their own loss, they tend to worry about their mother's feelings, and they also express concern about their mother's availability to them. In families where the subsequent children haven't been told about the surrendered child, then we worry about it too, because we see the children could very well be carrying some of the mother's pain, because children are so sensitive and you can't hide things from them, so they pick up on it, and in some way they may be acting out, they may be depressed, they may be just involved with her in such a way that they're somehow sort of holding her up. Yes?
Women feel threatened. Does that mean they feel jealous or neglected somewhat?
It's like in the case of the birth father's wife.
Yeah.
Well, there probably is a real reason for being threatened. I mean, it's here we're talking about, contact between.
Son and a real son.
That's right. In that case especially, right? You've got this woman has her son that's been adopted by the birth father, and so she's concerned about that, what's going to happen to that relationship. In addition, when you talk about birth fathers and birth mothers getting together again, and I think it's really essential, and I haven't really addressed it here, but that they work it through, that they talk to each other, but they generally have, the relationships are totally unresolved, and so there's a lot of energy there a lot of times.
There's always a fear that this birth mother could get the fellow back.
That's right. We actually had a woman in our group who left her husband and started living with the birth father after 20 years. So it can happen. I'm not saying that it will, but it can happen. And I think that's very rare. But there is certainly often a lot of feeling that gets stirred up. It can be negative feeling, but it's still feeling, So when I speak about the birth father's wife being threatened, I don't mean to make that sound just totally negative, because it certainly makes sense, and she needs some help in working that through too, but who's going to, who's there for them? Nobody. It really is too bad, because there's no acknowledgement of these issues in general in society. We're just beginning to acknowledge birth parents' issues, but to really help the spouses and the children is something we haven't even begun to address. So I think that's why it's so important to start talking about this stuff. Okay, so we bring the spouses in, we bring the children in, or we at least make sure we talk about it in detail. Here's some examples in this area. One 3-year-old girl, her mother used to talk about the loss in her presence a lot, and so this little girl would go to nursery school and she would collect all the dolls. You know how they keep the dolls in the cribs and stuff at nursery school? She'd collect all the dolls in her arms and she would cling to them for the whole class. And if other kids would come up to her, she would shriek if they tried to take a doll away from her. She was totally panic-stricken. And after a while, in this case, the mother began to figure it out, like, oh, okay, she's really relating to my issue here, and could, over time, with the teacher's help, they worked it out so they could help the little girl to feel and talk to her. Even at age 3, just sort of tried to reassure her and tell her that this was her doll, and also tell her that mommy was okay, which was the most important thing to do. Another case is when a mother told him about her older son, who had been surrendered 17 years before, a 5-year-old boy, asked why she couldn't keep him. He asked repeatedly, why couldn't you keep your baby, Mommy? Why? He then sort of stopped talking about it, and it wasn't until several months later that he went through a period of acting very aggressively, which wasn't typical for him. And he calmed down when his father suggested to him that maybe he felt left out because Mommy and Daddy were talking about adoption so much. So sometimes just the fact that the parents are so consumed with it, or the mother is, on the phone all the time or whatever, can be something you got to pay attention to, because the children can really, it's just like with any sort of grief or loss, the children who are left often are ignored. Okay. This other case, there were 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12, and they cried. They really sobbed when their mother told them about the older sibling who had been surrendered. And the 2 oldest seem to be handling it, 9 and 12-year-olds. This is going on fairly currently, and they are handling it fairly well. But the 6-year-old is asking repeatedly, again like the 5-year-old boy, why couldn't you keep my brother? Why couldn't you keep him, Mommy? And is very anxious about separating from her mother. Now the 9-year-old will say to the 6-year-old, well, she just couldn't keep him. It just wasn't possible, and it's sort of, it really seems to understand. But the 6-year-old is just totally cannot understand. Another one is a 4-year-old girl who did not respond verbally when her mother told her about a surrendered child. But the 4-year-old girl's behavior became aggressive soon after, and for an extended period. And the mother finally asked her why she was behaving so badly. She just sat down and had a good talk with her. And the little girl wanted to know if she too would have to give up her baby when she grew up. This was her question. 2 boys, ages 12 and 14, they were very excited. Their mother searched, and they were so excited about connecting with their older sister, who had been surrendered several years before. She was about 19. And they, of course, became very disappointed when she was not interested in the same kind of connection that they were. So, that's another kind of issue that comes up for the siblings around search. For many reasons, but particularly because of all the secrecy and because the pain of the loss is so great and pervasive for the birth family, working with birth parents is a complex therapeutic process. And search is a way of reconnecting with the lost child, with the lost self, and with the family. Obviously, a search outcome that's real positive and involves an ongoing loving relationship between the birth and adoptive families will enhance the healing power of a search. There's no question of that. But even in those cases, which are very rare, those ideal cases, there's still it's a very complicated life experience. Being a birth parent is not easy. And it's one that involves a myriad of losses that become intertwined over the years. The experience touches every aspect of the birth parent's life and the birth family's life.
Does the birth parent ever get over it, maybe when they're in their 50s or 60s?
Well, I think, what it is that search is part of this ongoing process of integrating and living with the adoption experience. And I think that we don't know enough about what happens to older birth parents. I think that part of the problem is that we've really wanted to get the message out and make it very clear that birth parents are hurt, you know. And so that's sort of been the main theme here. But I think, and there have been a lot of people, still people out there trying to do research to prove that birth parents get over it in 5 years. You know, I mean, there are people out there making an effort in that direction.
A lot of people say birth parents get over it. I don't think they ever do.
Well, yeah, I think what happens, I guess where my thinking is going, I just presented at the Origins Conference last month, and that came up at the very end. One woman, in fact, who is probably in her 50s from Maine, is very, very active there, said, you know, she said, I really didn't believe that I would ever get over this pain. She said, but in recent years, she's been dealing with it probably 10, 15 years now. She said, in recent years, I really can honestly say that I am not feeling the pain over the loss of my child. Now, I wasn't able to ask this woman, did she have a relationship with her child and all that, because I think that is certainly a factor. But she said, now this doesn't mean that my life isn't still complicated and difficult and a pain in the neck sometimes because I'm a birth parent. But the actual pain of the loss has really subsided, and I just don't feel that terrible pain anymore. And I tend to think that that might be the direction it goes in with the kind of support this woman has been able to gather for herself. You know, all of us, if we can continue to make sure that we get the kind of support we need in dealing with this throughout life, I think there's real potential for doing a lot of healing. I think there's, you know, have you?
But then when I thought about searching for them again, this pain had come back to me.
Yes.
Pain again.
It recycles. It really does throughout your life, and I think that if you search, you certainly face the pain full force. And people say, you know, I haven't been able to see my son, but just seeing pictures, talking to him on the phone, when people really see their adult children, it resurges, all this pain resurges and really comes up again, and you realize what you've really lost. Then you've got you've got the loss of grandchildren, the loss of that connectedness throughout the generations.
What you've lost when you lost it.
Yes. Now, you know, I look at the other side of that too. I say, you know, but we have that connection. No one can ever take it away. It's a physiological, biological, very strong connection, an emotional connection, psychological, that no one can take away. But, you know, there's still that terrible loss of the physical person and that relationship, that parenting relationship that is lost. Now, with people that lose babies through miscarriage, for instance, people who don't get help with their loss, we find are feeling that loss just as intensely 30 years later. We went into a doctor's office once, and we gave the woman our brochure, the woman at the desk, and she said, oh my God, she said, I lost a baby 30 years ago, and we used to walk the floor at night, and I thought I was absolutely crazy, and oh my God, I'm so glad you're out here doing something. And we have seen this over and over again with miscarriage. And we know that miscarriage, even though it's a very, very intense loss, does not have, if the person has the available resources to work it through, can be worked through to a pretty good extent. It's not long-term, like, say, the loss of an infant in the first year, which is very long-term loss. But miscarriage is the same intensity. But even with miscarriage, you find that even if they've worked it through, they've gotten the kind of support they need, years later there'll be this kind of shadow grief. Peppers and Knapp talk about this, that the woman will, on the birthday or just on a regular basis, sort of that sense of that lost baby. Now you can imagine, if you think about this in terms of birth parents, what that shadow grief is going to be about, you know. So it really, I think, is something that's very complicated with birth parents, because you've got a real child who's out there living, usually, and you're having to grieve the baby to begin with, the loss of parenting, the loss of the child throughout the child's life, the loss of grandchildren, the loss of connection to your the generations that go after you, all sorts of losses. But I think there is potential as we work on it more. I don't think I think what concerns me is that it's such an unnecessary loss in many cases. And I think that, you know, I look at all the other childbearing losses and say, my God, would anybody want to create this kind of loss if they could not do, you know, if they could prevent it from happening? And the answer would always be, well, of course, who would want to, you know, create this kind of loss? And yet with adoption, we somehow think that it's okay, that we can make it all better, or we can make it okay for the birth parents, so it's okay to do it. So I think That's some of the things that the intensity of the floss brings up for me. Now, what I was going to do, as I had said earlier, was to move into some sculpting, which is real, getting a visual idea of all this. I wanted to really, I love to do the sculpting. Has anybody ever done it before? But let's take a minute and see if there are any more questions, and then we'll see what we feel like doing, because we could just sort of do some discussion, continue to discuss your issues or your cases, or we could do some family mapping and look at some other families. Yeah.
I just wondered if you'd say a little bit more about the effect on the other children in the family who are not told about
Yeah.
the relinquishment of the first child.
Well,
You said something about
Right.
depression and acting out, but I
Yeah,
wanted to
yeah.
a little bit more detail.
well, I'm trying to think. I think probably what I know about is what happens, best is when people tell their children, the process of telling and how the children respond. Because we, of course, encourage that, so we see a lot of that and get the stories about that, which are really, usually really interesting stories. I think it would probably, how I think of it when their children are not told is much like you'd find in any family where, we've got families where there's a miscarriage and the parents choose not to tell. And even though it's very difficult to know how to tell a young child about a miscarriage, we suggest that you at least share that there's been a problem that mommy and daddy are dealing with, because the child will often feel, if the parent is depressed or obsessed in some way or highly anxious, whatever, the child will feel that somehow they've done something wrong. It depends on the age, but usually the very young child will think, what did I do? Mommy's upset. Now, if the mother is chronically depressed, it sort of depends too. If the mother's chronically depressed, then that may just be a sort of a state of being. The child may also be depressed, a bit depressed, would tend to be if mother's depressed. Mother may not be able to meet the child's needs fully, so there may be just an edge to it. But the child would then be somewhat depressed, maybe not as vibrant as the child could be if this had been worked through. But if the mother starts to deal with the grief all of a sudden, then I think you're more apt to see perhaps the child thinking, oh my God, I've done something wrong, and not having any sort of feedback on that, because the mother's trying to protect the child, doesn't tell the child, and yet may even be more irritable with the child or whatever, because they're so stressful to search or to deal with this issue. And the child over time will, I think may end up, in response to feeling that there's something wrong, may end up acting out in some way. I'm trying to think of of a specific example, Did you have any, are you a social worker or a birth mother or have you seen this in your children at all? Were you thinking of it in relation to your own situation?
Yeah, my own situation.
Yeah.
I didn't tell my daughter
Yeah.
until very recently, and she's an adult now.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know whether I, should have told her sooner or not. And I just wonder how much of
Yeah.
her difficulty during adolescence might have been, not they weren't severe,
Right.
but, and you never know, what causes what.
Well, I do think, I guess I just think that you're probably going to get more possibility of acting out during adolescence, because you can't sit down and say to your daughter, gee, I got pregnant when I was an adolescent. I want to see that happen to you, and you really can, talk it out. And you're probably going to have a lot of anxiety about, I don't know what you went through. I would think you'd have a lot more anxiety if you hadn't this opened up really, and sort of concern, and you couldn't really address it directly. And so it would be a lot like having an adoptive family who hadn't dealt with the infertility or they hadn't dealt with the adoption openly, and the daughter starts to act out sexually because she's identifying with the birth mother, and then they can't deal with it, they don't know what's going on, and so they can't talk it through because there's all this secrecy. And secrecy in general, I guess that's really the issue, secrecy in general in a family is harmful. It really tends to stabilize patterns that are not functional to begin with. So if we had a pattern around our surrender that was very unhealthy, where we were sort of kicked out of the family in a way, and our child was kicked out, and it was made a taboo subject, and then we had to sort of act in a sort of way that would be sort of pacify everybody, and sort of this apologetic kind of stance that birth parents take on in their family. Now that, when the secrecy happens, that means that everything gets sort of shut down and everything sort of stays that way. It gets rigid. It doesn't move again. And so that's the tendency. And so if you're continuing those positions, what does that mean about how you're going to be able to cope with your children? You're not going to have a lot of flexibility. Yes, go ahead.
No,
Oh,
listening.
Does that make sense? My family, let me give you an example. I have a very complicated adoption situation in my family, not just my own surrender, but I have 2 cousins, first cousins who have surrendered. I also have adopted cousins. 2 of my first cousins are adopted. And I also have a first cousin who has adopted. I should write out this. But anyway, so what happens is, God knows, you don't know in this family, this is a real good example of an extreme. We don't know who knows what, right? Now there's secrets here and there's secrets there, and so now everybody knows about mine because I've told everybody, I've made this very, very big effort, but for years no one did. Or they weren't sure, But I have a cousin who is still very much into the secrecy, and it's her sister that has adopted a child. Her sister doesn't know that her own sister is a birth mother, which means that the adoptive mother now cannot deal with the adoption issues that she has to deal with her daughter because she's trying to protect her family. She did an open adoption, but she doesn't really want her sister, who's a birth mother, and her mother, a birth mother's mother, to know that she did an open adoption. So she tells me, all this stuff gets crazy, right? Convoluted and all this secrecy. So I'm still struggling with, how am I going to deal with this? I can't tolerate this anymore, even being in the middle of other secrets, So I'm going to have to confront the people who are still keeping the secrets and tell them I don't want to do that anymore. It's all, But the secrecies have meant that it's broken up the communication among the family. No one can talk to anyone. You can't even talk to anyone about what they're doing, what they do for a living, how their children are. Nothing. You can't talk because something might come up that's not supposed to come up, right?
You can't remember who told what.
Yeah. It's insane. It's really silly, yes. And so I think that happens in every birth family to some extent. And we, I think, for instance, I'm thinking of my own situation with my son. I told my son when he was 5, and before that, I really feel what was happening is that, and I became more aware of it after I told him, that I was really disappointed that he was not the son I had surrendered. There's some of that going on. So I think I didn't even think about it until after I told him, and our relationship started to heat up a little bit. There had been no conflict before that in our relationship, but I almost think that I had used him, that he was sort of my replacement child. So I think by telling him and by opening it up myself, I was able to deal with that, work it out over time. But if I hadn't told him, I never would have even been aware of it. That's why I guess I'm saying, gee, what happens in these families, sometimes we're not even sure what's going on.
When children are told at a young age about a relinquishment, do they ever express fears that they will be given away?
Well, that's what you would think.
Yeah.
But what we found is, for instance, those 2 examples where the little girls thought they were going to have to give up their babies. The 2 little girls thought that. And the other fear is that the mother is going to leave the family. So it seems to work that way. I've been looking for that.
Yeah, you'd think that would be the most common response.
Now, the mother leaving would be similar
Right.
To that, but not quite the same as we're going to give you away. Yeah. I'm trying. Have you heard?
did that.
Did you?
Because I started out with them real little, because I have 3 now.
Yeah.
And I started out telling them before they could understand even what adoption was. We just talked about adoption. If we'd see something on TV or hear something, it just kind of led into it. And I will occasionally bring it up just to remind them. And I haven't heard anything, but now I'm wondering,
Yeah.
I just kind of broached that, that subject. But I haven't had any.
Scared themselves.
Yeah, they haven't seemed to be.
Now, you brought it up. You sort of talked about it all along, like.
Yeah, when they were maybe 2 or 3, and it just like one time we were watching a show, and it was about adoption, and they're like, "What's adoption?" And then who does adoption? And then we just kind of went into it, and they just took the information in and it just passed. Like they didn't even, and they know of it, know what happened, and we go into it a little bit more, and they'll have questions, or that I was coming to this, I just brought it up and told them, and they'll ask a couple questions, but it's kind of like everything else that they just learn. It's just part of, I've got cousins, I've got this, I've got,
Yes.
and it hasn't been a problem, but
Yes.
you never know if.
But they were how old when you told them? When you started?
Probably,
10.
some of them, well, my youngest probably was closer to 2 as he was hearing about it, maybe even younger.
Yeah.
But I don't know what connected, but the oldest probably 3 or 4, and the other
Yeah.
2,
Yeah.
3. It seems like it's worked out real
Yeah.
well.
Well, the other thing is you haven't been in the middle of search when you were telling them. So that may be a good thing, because you were able to tell them and sort of be okay about it. And
Yeah.
if you get in the middle of your search, you'll be more intense, feelings get stirred up, and so it maybe they'll sense it more then. But the point is that you've kind of laid the groundwork, which sounds like a good idea.
That's why I figured I don't want
Yeah.
to wait till she's 25.
Yeah.
and then get her away.
Yeah. It really, this whole issue of working with the birth families is really similar to working with adopted children, you know, and the new thinking there is that you tell children all along, you get them used to the word adoption, and then you bring it up as they're growing up, and you deal with it in an age-appropriate way at each stage. So when they're 4 or 5, they think of it in sort of a very mechanical way. They think of birth in a very mechanical way, and they don't quite understand yet, but it's a beginning, and they understand the idea that they didn't grow in your uterus if you're the adoptive mother. But it isn't until they're, to their 9 or so that they can really understand the loss of the birth family, and they start to grieve that. And that's when adoptive parents really need to key in. And all along, the suggestion is that adoptive parents bring the issue up with the children. You don't wait for them to bring it up. It's just like sex. If you waited for your kids to ask you about sex, you'd wait till they were 18, And so, and in fact, there's been some correlation in adoptive families between the ability to deal with adoption and the ability to deal with sexuality, because it's really, if you can't deal with one, you can't deal with the other. The openness has to be there, the communication has to be there. So I think the same thing applies to birth families. And I find it still hard to raise the issue with my children, and I don't do it all the time. I don't want to pressure them, but on the other hand, I don't think sometimes I allow them enough possibilities for discussion, And I might get consumed with it myself, and I don't think to say to them, well, where are you at with this, Or like you say, you bring it up when you go to a conference so they have a chance again to sort of address it. But I've been trying to do that more. I wrote a letter to my son, and I included my 10-year-old. He looked at the letter and gave me suggestions. It was great. So, as they get older, you can do more of that, I think. That gave him a sense of empowerment, too. Like he could have a part in it and help his mother do this and, sort of connect in that way to his brother. And, There's another technique that one of the birth mothers in our group thought of, and she told her children, and her husband is also the birth father, so they have a very intense situation, and he didn't want to deal with it at all, and he is also a Vietnam vet, he drinks. It's just, all this stuff going on. But she told her daughter, and her daughter immediately started a diary for her brother, a journal, and she'll be giving it to him if they eventually find him. But she writes in it, her first thing she does is write one of her stories, and Cinderella or something, told him about the story of Cinderella, because I think her first idea of him was as a little boy, and actually he's a lot older. But as she works with it, she'll grow him up like we have to do, and it'll be an opportunity for her to do that as she writes her journal. She keeps it under bed. She does it regularly. And that's a good way, too, for them to dialogue, the birth mother and her daughter about it.
I have a question. When you were up there, you were talking about how a miscarriage is a similar loss. I'm wondering how abortion would fit into the picture. It seems like there would be even more secrets about that
Yes.
than a miscarriage or
Yes.
adoption.
Well, it's interesting because my partner and I have been trying to get into the National Association of Social Workers for a couple of years. We present on adoption there. We wanted to present on abortion because we see people, and we don't want to take, we're concerned that politics in that area have meant that nobody's looking at the emotional issues. Either the pro-life people are saying, oh my gosh, it's the most devastating loss in the whole world, adoption's much easier, blah, blah, blah. Or, that's the one extreme. Or the pro-choice people are saying, oh, there's no problem. The woman has no feelings about it at all. And what we find is that even if there's not necessarily a sense of loss, and there often is, but even if there isn't, there's usually some guilt, some shame, all sorts of stuff rolled into it. And these women don't talk about what they've been through. And we don't usually get them in therapy until they've had 2 abortions, and usually the second one somehow was responsive to the first one, and then they tend to come in and talk about it. But there's also this feeling of being stupid that I think birth mothers can relate to, that I was stupid to get pregnant in the first place. That's awful. It was real strong with people who have abortions. So there are some of the same issues with abortion as birth mothers have in terms of having gotten pregnant in the first place, and how that feels.
I've had acquaintances, like currently, will come to me because they knew that I had a baby for adoption and tell me that they, at that time or shortly before or after, had had an abortion. And it was like, they didn't know where else to turn to. And I'm like, these weren't like real close friends or something.
Yeah.
But people that have, maybe just because I had been through what they could have or thought about or they felt bad about, but I was surprised at the number of people, and I didn't think of it the same way, but now I do. They probably feel loss than guilt.
Right.
I mean, I think they're experiencing more loss, feel more loss now, or
Mhm.
acknowledging it now than they did before.
Yes.
But I was surprised that they
Yes.
come.
And there are a couple of good books on abortion. One is called The Ambivalence of Abortion by Beryl Leaf Letterly. And she talks about, I think that's what the main theme is with abortion, is living with the ambivalence. You have to really accept that if you're, to tolerate it, to go on. But I think it is workable. And it's not the same kind of ongoing grief that you find with birth parent loss, where you have a live child that you have to deal with and the ongoing issues there. What you can think about to think about that is the bonding process, and we know that women bond very early on in the pregnancy, and but the later in the pregnancy, the longer term the loss tends to be. So if you have a miscarriage at 12 weeks, you're going to have as intense a reaction, feeling-wise, as you would have if you have a stillborn baby or an infant that you lose. But again, I've said this before, the loss, the intensity will not last as long with miscarriage or with abortion as it would with a loss that happens later on in the pregnancy or after the child is born. Another book, actually in a different voice, is that right? By Carol Gilligan, the one on women's development. She uses a study on how women make decisions about abortion as an example to discuss women's development and how women make decisions based on. It's interesting to look at. It would be interesting to look at birth parent decision, which I think is a non-decision, in that light. But because what she talks about is the way that men tend to make decisions in terms of right or wrong, this sort of black-white kind of thing, and that women tend to make decisions in terms of the relationships in their lives and all these complicated considerations. And she goes into this very interesting example, these little kids making a decision about whether or not to play with another child or something, and the interviewer says, what do you think? How would you decide about this? And the little boy goes, well, if I liked him, I'd play with him. If I didn't like him, I wouldn't play with him. And the little girl goes, well, now let's see. If this little child had, was a nice person and needed some friends and on and on and on. I mean, the little girl went on for, 3 pages in the book because you just had to consider every facet there, So it was, that's a real good example, I think, of how women really do think differently than men do. And it's the way we're socialized. That's not to say that it's what we're born with, but that's why we really need to work on helping little boys become more empathic and to really develop more of a capacity for relationships, dealing with emotions. Yeah.
I have a question from a very different
Yeah.
place, and it has more to do with search, really, than...
Sure.
But it's something I'm trying to grapple with. I mean, when we relinquish our babies, they're babies, usually, they're
Right.
newborn. And when we find them, they're usually adults, or
Right.
teenager, late teen adults.
Right.
And yet, I think it's very hard to perceive them or to image them even as adults. You expect to find a baby
Right.
at some level, unrealistic
Sure.
as it may be. You expect that what you're going to find at the end of your search is your baby,
Sure.
and what you find is a fully grown adult. And I haven't heard that addressed by anybody here or
Yeah.
in the reading that I've done or in my support group.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that gap between what you relinquish
Yeah.
and what you find?
Do you have some thoughts on
No,
that?
I was just going to say, I was like this lady, she said she's just coming to all this. She just found out about whether you can search in the conference and all that a week or so. That's where I was last year. And I think one of the most important things I heard at last year's conference was, you are never going to get your baby back. The baby is gone. And it was awful. I was devastated for weeks afterwards. But it's true.
Yeah.
You never, that baby, whether you saw the baby or held the baby or whatever, baby's gone.
Yes.
And somehow you have to deal with that awful grief. And then come along to see the person that's there. But the
Yeah.
baby's gone forever.
Yeah. I think the best way that grief is that feeling of empty arms, the sense that your baby is gone. And I see it with birth parents, that, longing to have more and more children, and real crisis when the childbearing years end, and you have to give up that idea of having any more babies, because at least that sort of takes care of it for a little while. Of course, then you have birth parents who do not have any other children, who either are infertile or they don't get involved in a relationship. They don't have any others, and they just sort of shut down, I think, a lot of times. But often they'll have a crisis around the end of the childbearing years and go, oh my God, did I do the wrong thing? And the loss becomes very acute. But I think that loss, the baby, you're right. I mean, it's so intense. That's really central. And I mean, I remember seeing my son's picture, a 17-year-old, and thinking, this isn't really who I want to see here, And you feel so terrible, but it really, and feeling, I think having to go through the loss of the baby over and over, it sort of recycles, doesn't it? I mean, you can get through a major piece of it, then it comes up again, and it'll probably come up again if you end up with grandchildren. There was a woman yesterday talking about that. She found her son, and he has 2 children, and she's gotten to be around the second grandchild more than the first. The first one, now she feels all this loss about the first grandchild who's 5 years old, thinking, oh my God, I didn't get to see him either, and I mean, it's just, yeah. So it's just, some of this, it's so hard because it just is the way it is, and it's really terrible, but the point is to be able to face it and then develop those coping skills over time, right?
Is helpful.
Yes.
To have somebody
Yes.
else say it.
Yes.
And to know you're not the only one.
Yes.
Who thinks, I'm going to go back there and get that little baby I saw in the
Right.
nursery, it's just.
Yeah. In that way, it is just like death. It really, that part of it is. And we can recoup, hopefully, some sense of reconnection with our older children. And that's where, that really came home to me when I've met women who are birth parents who found that their babies were dead, and that's very rare, but it does happen. And then I know that it's not totally the same as death. And I know there's a difference, but it really,
Our support
do you?
group found her daughter would have been 20, and she just did the search this year and found that she had committed suicide when she was 17.
Oh, God.
And her grief is just, I mean,
Yes. Oh,
none of us can deal
no.
with it. I mean, we're all just devastated.
It's so beyond, yeah.
It's just devastating.
Yeah, it's just so unbelievable. Mhm. Takes a long time to work that through. What about, I'm curious about your working with, where you call up a birth parent, you've got a great job, right? Who doesn't know that who is not searching herself usually, probably.
Right.
Yeah. How is that?
Usually.
Let me give you the, hold this so you can talk. Well, yeah, at least listen to you.
No, I can recall one case. It's been about maybe a year now that I found a birth mother.
Wait, we should tell, did you hear that this, that Julie does work? Tell, you can say it.
I'm the adoption investigator at the juvenile court in Kansas City, and I act as the intermediary, and I locate birth parents.
For adopting.
Right, uh-huh. And I can remember one case where I found a birth mother. I was positive that I had located the right woman. I had all the information. I spoke to her relatives without letting them know who I was. And I confronted the woman with the issue, to see if she wanted to make the contact. The woman completely denied that she had ever given birth to a child. And I gave her the opportunity. I said, ma'am, if I didn't know who was in the room with her. I thought maybe she just couldn't talk at that moment. But, I called her back, even 2 or 3 times. I left my number, for her to call. Just still to this day, she denies ever having a child.
Yeah.
And I can't, even in some of my other cases where birth mothers just flat out tell me no over the phone that they don't want to have that contact, I cannot see from way down deep where a mother would ever, we could work it out at court where they wouldn't have to know who they were. They could write to the court forward letters. They could still have that contact. But some women just flat out tell me no. I can't understand why a mother would say that.
Does anybody want to
I've
respond?
heard that before,
Yeah.
and I'm not a therapist, but the only thing I can think of is that it's so painful and so.
This marks the end of session 18, part 1. Now turn to session 18, part 2.
Keep your sanity and your sense of self is to just deny that it ever happened.
you know, and that if you were to open the door to admit that you really had done that terrible thing and had to let in all that grief that you just couldn't stand it, and that's the only reason a mother would say, no, it never happened, I didn't, you know. I mean, I don't really
Yes.
think it's because you have a life and you're afraid that, you know, your past is gonna come out of the closet and destroy everything. I don't think that's really very realistic for most people. I think it's more the idea of dealing with what you have to live with inside and, you know, admit that happened.
It sort of fits for me with the birth mothers who've said they really forget the date, you know, of the birth. And so there's denial, there's all sorts of levels of denial operating. And it's really, in my mind, it may even be possible this woman really
Believes
doesn't
that.
remember. I mean, it's probably very unlikely, but still, she may have just a little inkling of it. But, I mean, I heard someone yesterday saying she really didn't remember giving birth. And because there was a horrible scene where somebody put a towel over her face right as the baby came out. And she didn't remember that until she started to rethink this whole thing, but had blocked it out for years. Another woman said she really couldn't remember the date. I know women didn't remember the agency, the hospital, you know, all sorts of things.
I couldn't
You-
remember the agency.
Really? Yeah.
I wrote to a whole bunch of them
Yeah.
and said, you know, are you the one? You
Yeah.
know, I couldn't remember. I mean, I've only been there once,
Yes.
but, you know, it's not usually information that you would forget. And I wonder sometimes if you'd forget the day. I remember because it's right next to my son's birthday, the 2 days are, you know. But even the search person last year called me and she said, you know, we found the baby girl Taylor 1 year later in 1963. Are you sure it was 1962? And I said, look, Sue, I forgot a lot of stuff, but I know where I was in 1963. It was 1962.
Wow.
You know, you sit down and you think, did I really make a mistake?
Right.
You back up and you think, well, now I went to college then and then this happened then, you know, so you can fit it into a time. Really, it's so painful.
I wonder if there's anything you could say to someone like that. Does anybody, I mean, it's so,
Well, and I had the problem with, I had to go back to the adoptee and say, you know, I found this woman, but she claims that, you know, she never gave birth to you. And the adoptee just went off over the phone. She said, what? I wasn't born, you know? I didn't know what to say to the woman, you know? I just did not know.
Do you have a provision to be able to go back in 6 months and
It's
try
a year.
again?
I can try in a
No,
year.
And sometimes,
Mhm. And really, all the adoptee wants is medical history. So all this woman would have to do is just tell me over the phone her medical history, but she's, you know.
did she know
can't
that?
do it. Yes,
Yeah.
uh-huh.
You know, another suggestion I have, and I don't think this is going to help you necessarily, but I'm thinking that for me, and I think for a lot of birth mothers, there's this real rage at authority figures, you know, as social workers, agencies. So it's even possible that just the fact that you're calling from a
Probably.
state agent is just beyond her capacity. She just cannot even respond to you. I could even imagine myself maybe even doing that when I think about it, like thinking, well, I'm not going to talk to her, I'll talk to my son, you know, or I'll deal with this myself, but I'm not going to talk to anybody else. This is my business, and that sort of privacy issue, which is different than secrecy, where you feel like, well, wait a minute, I do have a right to privacy here. And so I don't know, there could be that going on.
I think she
It's
may
like-
not trust you at all.
No,
And when you
that's-
say all you want is medical history, she's thinking, no, that's not all she wants. She wants to blow this thing wide open, and I don't want it blown wide open. And how can I trust her? I never, you know, no one else ever did before me.
It might be something to say to her,
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
I wouldn't blame you if you didn't trust me or whatever, you know, sort of try to work with it that way. Like, I could understand that this would be really hard for you. I don't know, you probably said all these things already, but.
Well, I try
Yeah.
to be really even too kind to people when I
Yeah.
call, and I give them, you know, ample opportunity. But this was the first response I got like that, and I just didn't know how to.
Yeah.
Are most birth mothers receptive? or-
Yes, yeah, most are. I located about 54 last year for 1989. I
Wow.
think 63% were agreeable. So most are. Mhm.
And over time, you may find that more of those women, when you call back, if you do, in 6 months or
Mhm.
a year, they'll.
It
yeah.
seems like the older the birth mother is, the more likely she is to say no.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm talking about the ones that are maybe in the 70s or, you know,
yeah,
late 60s.
yeah,
But
yeah. I find it's very difficult to deal with, for me, to deal with women who are not, with that idea of women who are not willing to be found or to respond. And I think we all have a reaction to that, even though we can say in our heads, you know what, and we know intellectually what might be going on with these women. And I can even picture myself back there, 10 years ago and being sort of in a whole different place if I had been approached. But there is still something that I react to, and I have to sort of process when I deal with women like that, because I tend to be angry with them. So it's really tough, I think. And they're the ones who are the most needy, really. Most damaged by this, I think, most likely, yeah.
Question. As a family member, I know that my little sister is probably going through a lot and that she should be talking about this. Like, she was sending their birthday cards and Christmas cards to the agency, and a year ago, the agency sent everything back and said, we will not keep this on file, it will not be available for him.
Oh, dear.
But she doesn't talk to anyone. And when you were talking about the isolation, it's like she's isolated herself from the family.
Yes,
And I was just wondering how to approach her.
right.
Is there any way? I've encouraged her to go to counseling, but support her.
Like a cub group, birth mothers, with the birth mothers.
Where is she?
She's in Arkansas.
Is there anything in Arkansas?
I think they're all over the country. I mean, mine's here in Chicago, but I think the Cub is a group that has chapters all over.
Well, there aren't any in New York.
There aren't?
I'm a rep in New York, so there are people in New York.
But there's no group.
No, because there's other groups
Oh,
for
there are.
birth parents, yeah. But what you could do, there is a Cub newsletter. There's some free Cub newsletters down there. Did you get one of those?
There's a whole table of Cub literature in the
Cub?
book.
Concerning, yeah.
Concerned.
United Birth Parents.
They have a whole table of material in the book room. And some of it is free, some of it you buy, but,
There's a lovely gray book, I can't think what it's called, that Truth Seekers here in Chicago sent me when I
Uh-huh.
did last year.
Birth Parents Perspective, maybe?
It was wonderful.
Uh-huh. You don't remember what it was about?
No,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
They have a wonderful literature. They've got their literature list down there on the table. And they have, on the back of their newsletter, they have the area reps for the whole country listed. So you could get someone nearby, contact them, and see what they know about groups in the area. Also, if you contact the main office for AAC, you may be able to find someone here who can tell you. They know where the groups are all over the country as well. I mean, they're really the umbrella organization. And they can get you to at least a person in that area. Because that would be your best chance of helping her to have a safe person to talk to. Just trying to think of how to do it so that you really... Are you going to tell her you've been here?
Yeah. I told her about the conference before I came.
Yeah?
I told her about it, and I said if she would be interested in coming, that I would pay for her to attend.
Yeah?
And
how old is she?
she's only 20,
Yeah.
And how long ago did she move?
5 years ago. She was 14 when she got pregnant.
What I find, we have a lot of these young birth mothers who come to our group, and we find that they're very skittish. I mean, they really are, the pain is so raw, and they'll come, and they stay connected, usually. I can think of a couple that have not, but we've tried to stay connected with them. We make a special effort to call them and make sure they know that they're welcome. And at first we thought we were going to have 2 different groups, for younger birth mothers and older birth mothers, but we found that we can work it out, and that it's very good for all of us. We have 2 now are very active who are in their 20s, but they even have pulled back. I think that it's just, most of us have been dealing with this for 20 years, and we knew how to push the pain down and all this sort of thing. So we really are ready. I mean, we have to. And their sort of hope of making anything happen. We can say, we can search, we can find and we can make a connection. Now, these 2 women, even in my group, who are in their 20s, have found their children. They had private adoptions, so they went and they found their children. And actually, I didn't think that was a bad idea because they didn't know where their children were. And I think, if there's an agency adoption, I'm usually not too nervous about that. Hopefully, the children are, have been put in a good home. But they found their children, and they've both tried to make some connection with the adoptive family to open up the adoption. They have, neither of them had any luck so far, but there's sort of beginnings in both cases. But even so, you know, they're much more limited. I mean, they can't just go see their child. They wouldn't do that. And they're both handling it very well. But they need some relief from the pain sometimes, and they just have to kind of go on with their life. But they're an example of people who are really dealing with it. They're the best example I can think of. People who are dealing with it just a few years down the road, and they're very mature women, and they're still really struggling with staying in touch with the pain. So I think someone like your sister may contact someone, but I wouldn't expect she'd go on a regular basis to a support group. Maybe eventually, though, maybe someone in the support group would encourage her to get into therapy, which certainly is a possibility. I would think that therapy that would help her figure out how to deal with it, not necessarily to have to deal with it all the time like you'd have to if you're going to a support group, but how to deal with it so that you can do some grieving now and feel like you're not going to totally shut down, so you won't have all these other problems develop. As we feel like with these women, as a group, we've really worked with them. You know, we feel very proud of them, and they feel so happy that we've been there for them, and they really, I think, are going to avoid a lot of the problems that come with the denial. You know, the long-term denial. So I think. But I think in terms of just you're maybe slowly trying to talk to her and telling her, look, I lost a niece or nephew. I lost a nephew. I feel this. You know, I really feel that we have to deal with this as a family, trying to dialogue with her periodically and open it up.
I know that in my situation, one of my good friends at the time was an adoptee. And she would like reach out and ask me a question or try and get me to talk. And I would just shut her out, just ignore it, didn't want to say anything. But inside I was thinking, and I never said to her, ask me again later, I'm going to get there. You know, I kept wanting her to say it, you know.
Yeah.
And it was like I kept waiting for her almost to try and get me to talk, even though I knew I was not going to talk. And it took years and years, but it was like I needed that. And I know a few other people tried, and I tuned them out. You know, I just wouldn't talk to them, and they gave up.
Yeah.
You know, but she didn't, and she's here at the conference today too. I was real surprised, but maybe because she was coming from the adoptee standpoint, she wasn't going to let up. And I was just like, I wish there were a few other people, you know, relatives close by that had not let up. Don't let up.
Well, I'll keep up then, because last
Yeah.
time I saw her, I said something to her, and she just said, I'm okay.
You
So,
know,
like, back
even
off.
just to ask and
Yeah.
helps, you know.
Yeah.
You know, do you want to talk?
Yeah.
How do you feel? I don't talk about it. Okay, but just to know that somebody is out
Yes.
there, that to me was the
Right.
biggest help. You know.
Yeah. And you might even say to her, look, I know you're not okay. I mean, you might be okay at this minute, but I know you're not okay all the time. This is not an okay thing, you know. And but you know, I know also that you may not feel that you can talk about it right now. But just to let her know that you're not buying into that, you know.
The last time I talked to her, I felt like she thought I was, you know, too pushy with her. So,
But still, she knows you're there.
Yeah.
You know, which I think sometimes
Yeah.
that's even enough.
It's tough when you're the older sister too. I think I have a younger sister, and she gets so mad when I push her. So I suppose that's another thing. I have to tell her I'm trying not to be bossy. You know, but, you know, it doesn't. Oh, it seems not to matter how I approach her. It's always seemed that way. So I suppose you have to watch that. But you could at least acknowledge that, maybe. You know.
And it's nice it must be nice for her to know that you love her and understand, you know,
Bye bye. You going? Yeah.
Yeah.
See you later.
My family never talked about it for 27 years. You
Yes.
just know that, and I'm going, you know,
I know
thought
it.
we were unique. And I, you know, after the conference last year, I went home and I told my children, and then I talked with my parents, and I talked with my brother and my sister. And I thought, after all these years, my brother and sister would know.
Yeah.
They're a good deal younger than I am, and, you know, I was much older. And they said, well, we've always known. You told us. You know,
did.
We had young cousins. It was a very convoluted story, but we had young cousins who were living with us, and they had heard from their mother, and one of them was angry with me and said, I know you. You had a baby in her mom. And I said, yes, so, you know, and my brother and sister were in the room. I had completely forgotten it. All these years, no one said anything. I mean, you know,
Isn't that
nobody
amazing?
said whatever happened, or do you ever think about it,
Yes.
or whatever. I would have been so grateful.
Yes.
And over the years, there are people along the way
Yes.
whom I have told, because I had to tell someone, but never in the family. And it would have been a great comfort to me,
Yeah.
you know, just, even if they'd said, okay,
Right.
you know, even if I didn't talk about it. So-
Yeah, it's because I said, you know, that sometimes the women in the family don't empathize, which I think is true, but other times they empathize, but they really are trying to protect you. They think you can't, I don't want to open this up for you, that would be a terrible thing.
My mother would discuss it.
Yeah.
She, my father did say was, my father said, I want you to know how sorry you are. We made it impossible for you to keep the baby. And we have always felt badly about that. And if there's anything we can do to help you in searching for her, we will do it. Now, my mother's on the phone, but the word I get through the family is, she thinks I should have DNA testing because if I were really her daughter, I would not be doing this. So I sent word back through the grapevine that, you know, she wants me to go for DNA testing. I'd be pleased to do so. She's not going to get rid of me that easily. I'm really her daughter, but you know, so I'm not getting. There is still no. She cannot.
Yeah.
So she can't. I have my life and my things I have to deal with. And
Right.
that has always been that way. It's not
Yeah.
going to be different. At least I don't expect it to be different. And I still have to do what I have to do. And I can't be stuck with whatever her difficulty is. But at least, you know, for the most part.
That's
There
interesting.
was something else you mentioned, I don't mean to talk so much, but my daughter is 15. I have a daughter and a son. And when I told my children last year, they immediately picked up the telephone and called all their friends. You know, it was like, and I'd say, well, I thought, you know, this is not a secret anymore. But, you know, I could hear my daughter on the phone. Oh, yeah, you know, we're looking for my, you know, I have another sister and we're looking for my mother. You know, the whole story is like taking out ads in the newspaper. But my daughter said, you know, several months later, she said, and the kids have been very supportive, everybody really has. But she
How
said,
old are they? This is the...
My daughter is 15 and my son is 24.
Okay, and the one...
And what I'm looking for is 28.
Oh, okay.
And she said to me, are you still going to love me as much when you find my sister? Because I'm not the only daughter anymore. I've always said, you know, she always said, which one do I love the most, Jimmy or her? And I said,
Right.
but you're my only daughter, so
Yes.
I love you the most, of course, which is a little stupid thing to say. With
Yes.
respect, and not truthful either. But I said, it really doesn't matter. It's not the same. You know, you're my daughter and I've always had you.
Right.
And she's my daughter, but I was never her parent always.
Yes.
It's not, you know, she can never replace you. You know, she
Right.
was the firstborn, but it's not the same. I don't know if that's the right thing to say to my daughter. You know, 15-year-old. I don't know what else to say.
Sounds like...
I'm not gonna love her
That's
any
what you
less.
mean, yeah. I think there's, let's see, Joyce Paveo mentioned the second first son and the second first daughter, and, you know, like my son is the second first son, and
Right.
that becomes an issue, yeah. And actually, my daughter, who's younger, who's only 7, will rub it in. She'll say things like, well, you really aren't the first child, Isaac, or, you know,
That's what I said
yeah.
to my son. I
Yeah.
have some bad news for you. You're not the oldest. You know, all these years you thought you were the oldest,
Uh-huh.
you really aren't. You know, he said, okay, Mom.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
And he went back to his office and he called me up on the phone and he said, are you all right?
Oh.
You know, is there anything I could do? And I said, no, really, I'm fine, but it must have been a horrendous shock for him.
Right.
You know, but you have to do what you have to do with it.
Yeah.
I think people are more receptive than you give them credit for the most part.
Yes, I think most of the time you hear that when people tell their children, it's really received quite well.
My children wonder, are there any other secrets, Mom?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, good question,
That's
huh?
yeah, you know, there's nothing else. That's big enough.
Yeah.
You know, you don't need to have it.
Oh, dear. Well, anybody else? I think let's see, we're about 10 after 11. This was supposed to go to 11:45, which I think was sort of a mistake because it was originally a 2-hour workshop. And we could have kept it going. We could keep it going, but did anybody have anything else you want to bring up?
Any suggestions if you want to start thinking about, I mean, I'm just thinking about searching. I mean, I think I'm going to.
Yeah.
I'm just like brand new and like.
How old is your surrender child?
16.
Was the agency? Yeah.
through an agency. So I know nothing.
You don't have any information?
No, they gave me absolutely nothing. At the time, I asked for something, they would give me anything, and then when we signed the papers, I remember when he was born, I remember looking at the clock, and I know the time. But when I went to sign the papers, there's a totally different time on there.
Oh, there is?
Totally different. And then they were trying to tell me that he was born the next day, and I wouldn't sign the papers because I said, well, no, that's not the case. It was, I mean, I knew I was cognizant, I didn't know anything, no.
Is that here in Illinois?
Yeah, in Illinois. And somebody said to me recently, they monkeyed with my birth records, that an adoptee who was looking, said they had monkeyed with their birth records. I wonder if they did that. I'm just like, I'm just kind of overwhelmed by all this now.
When I talked to the agency here, they told me I was entitled to a birth certificate. It was in my file. And she said, would you like to have it? And I was sitting on the phone going, I killed that, And
Yes.
I said, oh, really? Could I have that? And she said, oh, yes, I'll send it to you. So I would assume that in Illinois, that is
Yes.
the law. The
They
only
tried to
thing,
get me to sign papers that were covered up. Just put your name here, that paper on top of it, just sign here. I didn't want to do that. I was just,
Wow, I've never heard that one. That's really something.
I don't know, I just was like,
Oh.
is this, you don't know if it's standard.
That's
or
right.
if it's,
the agency, my agency is here in Chicago, and they said to me when they sent for the file, we would search for you for $50. She said, I'm looking at your file, and there's enough information in here. I'm sure I could find the adopted family. It wouldn't be difficult at all. I'm thinking, but I said, well, I'll think about it. What I was really thinking inside was, no way. I'm going to do this myself. Because
Right.
I said to her, how would you do that? I knew good and well, because I'd been to last year's conference. They're going to get in touch with the adoptive parents, and if the she confirmed that for me, and if the adoptive parents say no, they don't want to tell the child that I'm looking, that it stops right there. And I thought, no way, somebody interfered in my life all those years ago.
Right.
I'm going to do it this time. I don't care how much money it costs to do it around about. I want to get in touch with my child, and if she says, get out of my face, I want to hear it from her, not through the intermediary.
And she's a lot
adoptive
older, too.
parent.
She's 28, you said?
Oh, yeah, I could be a grandmother.
I
they
mean-
still have to.
Yeah, they
Even if
will
the
not.
child's 28, they'll contact.
That's why I said they said, no way, only the adoptive parents. So there are people here, and if you want, I'd be glad to put you in touch with the people that I've talked to here who helped me along the way. What year was your child born? 73. Records were here in Illinois till 1964. It must be kind of like a legal paper, the Law Journal in New York, or it was called the Law Bulletin. Often adoptions were published in there, Mr. and Mrs. Jones adopt baby girl, or whatever, and the date, and sometimes they could trace it back that way. But after 1964, there's no record. The only thing that I've learned from the people here in Chicago is that after that, the only way to do is to pay somebody to find the name, which is ultimately, they could find mine.
Yeah.
So mine was old enough, ultimately I paid
Right.
to get the name. But I think that you put in so much money, and I know it. And I know how you feel. I was right there last year. I thought, oh God, shall I do this? And I went home and I talked to my husband, and he said, we've spoken about her every year since we've been married. 19 years. And I said, I haven't. He said, yes, you have. Yes, you have. You just don't remember. And I do think every year at her birthday, I would think, well, when she gets older, maybe when she's 18, I'll write the agency and put a letter in the file. I said, you never. I don't know, but you have to do what you have to do when you're ready. And there were periods in the last year when I just said, I can't deal with all this. And I would forget about it, because some mornings I just couldn't get out of bed.
I think one of the things I do suggest to people as a possibility, I mean, if you have a research group, they'll really help you with this in detail. But one of the ways that agencies might be willing to be helpful is if you do contact the agency and go in for some supportive work. And, like I know one of the agencies that's very good where I am, if they have an adopted family come in or a birth family, they're much more apt for counseling. They're much more apt to give them information because they can justify it in their own head. That this family needs this information to process the adoption, and so we'll give it to them rather than you just come in and you say I want this information. They're a little more uneasy about giving it to you that way. But it depends on your agency. Maybe they're very progressive now. You
I
never
think
know.
they do by law have to send you non-identified information.
After 21, though, probably, right?
Now that I don't know.
Probably not
That's
till
what
21. I don't know. Which seems crazy because you should have had that to begin with, but they make up all sorts of. Now, a lot of the a lot of things they say are just, policy. Did you hear Ken Watson's address?
No, I just got here.
Because he talked, and I think he was doing a workshop, but he talked about the idea of agencies make their own policies. They're not necessarily based on the law, so you have to be really confronted with the agency and continually call back and ask them what they're basing this on, and if they say, they eventually will have to say policy if it's policy, and then you say, well, is there a way we can change that? What's the way that we change this policy in your agency, and how can I go about doing that, and all this sort of thing. Now, that takes a lot of energy. It's easy for him to say, but so that's where you need your support group. You really need to be working with people to do that kind of thing. What we're trying to do in our groups, get, for instance, 4 or 5 people who surrendered from the same agency and kind of get together and strategize about how to go for that agency. But this particular agency has just not been, in fact, they've been terrible. But, where they won't even talk to the birth parent or acknowledge that they went to that agency or even that kind of thing. So I think if you can, over time, put pressure on them, it's like he said, he has a conservative board he has to respond to. Sometimes these people have directors who are very conservative. They have to, so the individual social workers often want to be there for you, but they can't sometimes because they'll be in jeopardy if you yield them. So it's sort of how do you help them give you what they want to give you in the first place. One of the social workers in Syracuse comes to our meetings, she'll say, now, if you ask me, she tells us, she says, you have to ask me questions that have a yes or no answer. She can tell you whatever you want to know, but she can't tell you anything outright, So you have to really think ahead of time what you want to know, write it all out.
And of course, the fabled story is always about the social worker who will meet with you at the agency, if that's because you're here, that's an option, and who will say, no, gee, I can't tell you anything, and then say, oh, I have to go, run out for a minute, I have to
Yes.
go. And they'll go out and leave the file on the desk, and, you have just time to look and get whatever you need.
Well, we had one
I don't know
recently.
how often that happens.
We had one recently where it was in a county child welfare, and this is an area in the state that's particularly progressive, but they're really restricted in New York. So this woman turned the pages, and the back side of the write-up was right there so they could read it, So they were saying, she'd keep turning them, and slowly she'd look at the page, and then they'd be reading the stuff that she had blanked out, was there, like the names and everything, they got everything.
New York is absolutely wonderful.
It's terrible.
Just
Yeah, it's unbelievable, though, the people who have managed to find in New York, and have done it by just picking away at it. It's unbelievable, some of these persistence.
There's one lady, I was part of a support group briefly last year, where an adoptee found his mother. He went through, there's some sort of record at the public library of birth certificates or something, registrations. And in New York, they don't change the numbers.
Yes.
And he went through however many he had to go through till he found the numbers that matched.
In New York City, you can do that,
Yeah.
and they have lots of New York City funding.
The birth registration is the same on the original birth certificate as on the amended certificate. We just went through and found the earlier one. I don't understand that. I'm
Yeah.
just repeating what he said, but I.
Right. Yeah, in the New York Public Library, in the city, they can go and trace somehow. We haven't had anybody that needed to do that.
New York is just, they have a registry in New York, but you have to have the birth father, the birth mother, and the adopted parents' consent. They've never matched anyone, ever.
What we do is we suggest people to get their non-identifying, because they have to sign up with the registry to do that, and then forget about the matching, because the next step they don't accomplish. But they can get their non-identifying information. Adoptees can in New York. Birth parents can't, technically. But they can go to the agency and say, the law doesn't prevent you from providing me with this information, so I want to get it. But no one has really pursued the agencies to a great extent in New York, I think. It's very exhausting to go back to your agency, I think. It's really hard.
The whole process is exhausting. But maybe not so much, it's not like you have an edge because you've been telling your children about it and you've been open about it all along. I never told my children because I don't know what point is there in knowing about a sister they're never going to know, because I believe what they
Right,
told me.
sure.
And never, all of this adoption
I
passed
believe
me
it.
by, I had, until last year, only by a fluke.
Yeah.
Oh, it wasn't really a fluke. I found the birth mother I work in a law office, and it had been a private adoption, and I located the birth mother for our client who was an adopted adoptee. And all of this just kind of came tumbling to the surface.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
called an organization out here, and they said, oh, by the way, there's a conference in New York. And I said, where? It turned out to be a block away from where I work, and my son was one of the managers, the service managers, for the conference. He was working with Joe Salt to set it all up.
Wow,
So I,
that's great. Isn't that interesting?
But I,
Yeah.
I just never told my children. So you're already that much further along.
Yeah, that's, I know we had a birth mother in the group who just came into the group and was just gung-ho to find, she had surrendered 2 children, was gung-ho to find them, and I was really nervous because she just was starting to search immediately, hadn't been to the group at all, but she had done so much processing over the years. She hadn't even been in touch with any groups or, some people come in, they've written to Cub and they've had the newsletter for years, and you feel that they're pretty, done a lot of substantial work on their own. But this woman hadn't done anything but just herself. She had somehow managed to process this stuff over the years, and so she, within a month, found her children.
Groups are
Has
different.
made contact, and she's dealing with it, and she also came in, she hadn't told her children that she was raising. Her husband knew, but she hadn't told her, and so she dealt with all this within a month. She's done the whole gamut, and she really was ready. She's so solid, so it really just depends a lot on where people are starting.
Groups are different too. I know I went briefly to one group and I just couldn't handle it. And in retrospect, after a couple of months, I went 3 times. And looking back, I thought the reason was that there was no perspective. This was it's a purely personal, subjective thing. This group was only birth mothers. And many of them had found there wasn't a lot of support in terms of feelings. It was more search stuff. And there were a number of mothers there for whom I felt this was their sole thing in life. There was absolutely nothing else. And I wanted to stand up and scream, I have another life, this is really important to me, but I am a person apart from this. My whole identity is not defined by what happened, all that long time ago. And now I've gone to a different group, to Joe's group,
Yeah.
which is a mixture of birth parents and adoptees, and I find that, for me, that's more useful. So I think, if where you find the first place doesn't fit, then
Try
go to
another
another one.
If you live in this area, you probably have some choices. That'd be good. They have information on groups downstairs.
I'll give you the group that I was in touch with, Rachel Cobb. That's the one.